Previewing before Chinese lessons is a simple yet frequently overlooked method to enhance learning. By previewing, you maximize the benefits of each lesson, allowing you to focus on areas where you truly need a teacher's guidance. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about the importance of previewing. I think that when I say that you should preview before every Chinese lesson, this sounds obvious, but judging by the fact that almost no students actually do this, I think this episode is still warranted. Both students and teachers want to increase the efficiency of language lessons. If you are a student, you want to gain more from the investment in time and money, and if you're a teacher, you're interested in helping your students learn as much as possible. There are, of course, many things you can do as a student to get more out of the lessons that you have, but few are as easy to implement as previewing, and few also have as much impact as previewing can have. As mentioned, most students don't preview properly, or indeed preview at all, and interestingly enough, it seems that it is the most ambitious students who preview, even though the other students would get more out of it if they also previewed. The main benefit with previewing is that it helps you use your time more efficiently. And this is true whether or not you're hiring a private tutor for a one-on-one lesson, or if you're enrolled in a university course alongside 20 other students. Regardless, there is some content, a curriculum you want to work your way through, and there is also associated language in terms of vocabulary and grammar. We can then look at a spectrum between two extremes when it comes to previewing specifically. First, at one end of the spectrum, we have no previewing at all. And this means that most things you encounter in class will be entirely new to you. You can still learn a lot from a lesson like this, but it depends on your level and how difficult the lesson is for you, and if the teacher is teaching in such a way that it is possible to follow along without having seen anything in advance. If your level is below that of the course in general, this probably won't work because you won't understand much. But even if your level is above that of the course, you still benefit from previewing, as we shall see. If you don't preview properly and encounter much of the language in the lesson for the first time in the lesson itself, it means that even if you can make sense of it during the lesson, you still need to work with this afterwards, you need to review, and you might need to go through everything again to make sure that you really understand, and only then will you fully be able to grasp what the lesson was about. Naturally, if your level is much higher than the lessons you are taking, then this doesn't apply, but then again, I see little reason in applying for a course that easy. An additional downside of not previewing is that if you haven't received the input first through listening and reading, it is extremely difficult to use new words and grammar patterns accurately, and many teachers still require you to do this. So if you encounter these things the first time in the lesson, be prepared to almost always get them wrong when you try to use them, whereas if you previewed properly, you would stand a better chance of using them correctly. Second, at the other end of the spectrum, you could preview properly before each lesson. And I will go into more details later in this episode what properly means here, but for now we're just assuming that you spend adequate amount of time before the lesson. This means that you will be familiar with most of the language covered in class, although there will of course always be things that pop up because teachers adapt to what the students say and so on, but the basic core content of the lesson will be familiar to you in advance. Naturally, previewing properly here doesn't mean that you learn everything to the extent that you don't actually need the lesson, but it does mean that you will already know what things are somewhat easy and what areas you really need a teacher's assistance sorting out or clarifying. With this approach, you still need to review to retain the information that you have learned, but you don't need to go through the lesson just to understand what it's about, because you got that in the lesson, and if there was anything you didn't understand, you would have had opportunity to ask your teacher, which wouldn't work if you didn't preview, because then it's hard to know which things are actually hard, because everything is new, and therefore you don't know. Now, the interesting thing, and the main reason that I recorded this episode, is that both these approaches take roughly the same amount of time. When you are previewing properly, you are investing more time up front, which means that when you go to the lesson, you get more out of it. And then, of course, you need to review for long-term retention, as I said, but you are basically done once the lesson is over. If you are not previewing properly, it means you will get less out of the lesson. You will waste time on things that you could equally well have done yourself, and in order to truly understand what you did in the lesson, you probably need to spend a lot of time after the lesson. And so what I'm saying here is that the best thing to do is to take that time that you will invest anyway and put it before the lesson rather than after the lesson, because it has no serious downsides. It does have several upsides though, so let's have a look at 5 reasons why you should preview before every lesson. I should say that some of these benefits come about because of how Chinese is taught in formal education, and if you have a tutor or a skilled teacher who does this in a different way, maybe you don't need to preview in this way, or at least the benefits would not be as marked. For example, I mentioned output earlier using new words and grammar patterns. And something I really don't like is when teachers force students to speak or write using vocabulary that they just saw for the first time in this very lesson. Output, speaking and writing, should always be preceded by input, i.e. reading and listening, and you should be familiar with words and grammar patterns before you try to use them. Sure, you can guess how a word is used based on the English translation in your textbook or one single example, or you could use a grammar pattern based on how it's explained in the textbook, but the likelihood that you get this right is rather low, at least for more non-obvious pieces of vocabulary and grammar, and simply guessing here isn't doing much for your Chinese at all. I talked about this more in episode 194, which was about Chengyu, and I said that learning Chengyu, you can never do this kind of guessing because you will almost always be wrong. And this is, at least to a certain extent, also applicable to grammar, to phrases and words in general. So the first benefit of previewing before every lesson then is that input can precede output. I already said why this is useful, and the benefit of previewing here is of course that you can start working on the content in advance, you can listen to the text many times, you can read it, and you can get some input before your teacher forces you to use the new grammar and the new words and so on. The second advantage of previewing is that it increases the chance of incidental learning. And what I mean by that is that because you know a lot about what's going on, you know the basic words, grammar, and so on, you stand a much better chance of picking up other things that might fly around in the classroom that you actually might want to learn more than some of the core content of the lesson. It could be something that a classmate says, or it could be something your teacher says in passing or when explaining something else. And if you were fully focused on understanding the basic meaning of everything, you would not catch these nuances. There might be new words you wouldn't have noticed or expressions that are quite useful that would simply have been lost in the noise. Incidental learning is when you learn something without really trying to, it just happens. And for this to be possible, you need to understand almost everything surrounding this new word or this new expression. Otherwise, you probably won't learn it simply by hearing it, and indeed you might not even notice it. Benefit number 3 is less confusion leads to more learning. When you already know what the lesson is about, including the basic meaning of vocabulary, grammar, and so on, understanding it becomes much easier and you can focus on nuances and details instead, for example, in how these things are used. This means that you can often avoid that feeling that I think all Chinese students have had at some point, where the teacher is explaining something and you kind of know what they're talking about, you have a hazy idea, but you don't really know. And this is not ideal if you want to learn the word and remember it later, and indeed this will force you to actually go back and read through or go through this on your own after the lesson, as I said earlier, provided that you haven't previewed, of course. Benefit number 4 is that teaching others is a great way to learn. A possible counter-argument to my advice to preview properly is that if you are the only one who's previewing properly, you're kind of wasting your time because you will know more than anybody else and the lesson will progress more slowly, at least it will feel like that. I don't really think this is a problem, and helping your classmates and teaching them things is also awesome for your own learning. And this does not mean that you are learning less. Now, naturally, if the course is significantly below your level, this might be a problem in itself, but I don't think that previewing and thereby knowing a little bit more in advance than most of your classmates is a bad thing. The fifth and final reason why I think previewing is great is that it can also lead to boosted confidence and more enjoyable lessons. Being well prepared for something means that you will feel more in control during the lesson, and this will of course enhance your learning experience in general. Again, this is particularly true if the course is significantly above your level, because if you are not previewing, you will not understand much and you will feel bad about your learning, and you might question your decision to enroll in this course and so on. For more about learning, including previewing, in a class that is very difficult, please check out episode 82, which was all about how to survive in a tricky language course. So to summarize, reviewing maximizes your use of high-quality study time. Without previewing, you will waste valuable teacher time on things that you could equally well have done on your own independently. But if you do preview properly, it means you can use the lesson for things you really can't do that easily on your own, such as experimenting with the language, asking questions about what you're learning, and figuring out nuances and using these words in context. Before we wrap up this episode, let's talk a little bit about what to preview and how to do it. This list is adapted from the episode that I just mentioned about surviving in a very difficult language course, and of course I've removed some things that are not relevant if the course is not super hard. This is just for a normal course roughly on your level. So the first one is to listen to the text or whatever content you will cover in class at least once with overall understanding in mind. Then you can continue reading the material, again with overall understanding in mind. Your goal here is not to understand everything, it's just to get the gist as much as you can while focusing on meaning. Once you've done that, you will probably have identified characters and words that you don't know, and then you can look these up in the word list or in some other way. And again, understanding of the specific use in the text is what you're after here. You do not need to know how to use these words in general, you just need to know what they mean in the context that they are presented. Next, you listen and read the text again, and with the knowledge that you now have, you should be able to get at least the gist of what's going on, and sometimes much more than that. Now it's time to put the audio on your phone and make the text easily available so you can listen to it while you're out walking, or if you have a few minutes you can glance through it on your phone. Optionally, you can look things up later. If you listen and you realize that there is a grammar pattern you really don't get, well, you can check the explanations in your textbook if you use a textbook, or look them up on the grammar wiki or something else. But generally speaking, I think this is enough for most normal lessons. So in essence, try to focus on input, reading and listening, and try to focus on meaning, on what these things are trying to convey, not on how they are used, the finer nuances and so on. You can do those things in class. Naturally, it's also useful to take notes and write down any questions you might have, as we talked about in last week's episode. So do use your notebook and write things down so you know what to ask once you are in class and have a teacher available. If you hadn't previewed properly, you wouldn't know which questions to ask, and these questions would indeed pop up after the lesson when you go through the text or the content on your own, and then you don't have a teacher to ask and you need to find someone else to do it for you, which is not optimal. So if you want to be efficient about your learning, and this is true if you're a very ambitious student or if you're a lazy student alike, because as I said, if you invest the time up front or afterwards, you will probably need to spend roughly the same amount of time, but if you put it before the lesson, you will learn much more and you will get more learning out of every hour you invest. And this is equally good if you're lazy or if you are super ambitious. Unless you have unlimited access to teaching time, which is rare, maximize your lessons by previewing. It doesn't require significantly more time, just a shift in effort from after the lesson to before it. By doing so, you will understand and learn more, and also make your lessons more enjoyable too. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.